All right, so, we're always getting questions about Russia's moves around the world, and, you guys sent in some really interesting stuff about the Primakov Doctrine, and I think this could be a great deep dive.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's more than just some old theory from the past. It's really shaping how Russia is acting today.
Exactly, and that's kind of our mission here, right, to figure out just how this doctrine is playing out, like what's the connection to the stuff we're seeing in the headlines. So to get started, maybe you can kind of give us the Primakov Doctrine 101, like what is it and where does it come from?
Okay, so the Primakov Doctrine, right. To really get it, we got to go back to Russia in the 90s after the Soviet Union collapsed.
Okay.
Think about it. Total economic chaos.
Right.
Russia feeling like it's lost its place as a superpower. And on top of that, like a sense of betrayal by the West.
Yeah.
Especially with NATO moving eastward.
Right. Yeah, like a lot of instability, resentment brewing.
Yeah, exactly.
So how did Russia respond initially? Like, what was their first move?
So Boris Yeltsin, who was Russia's first president, he tried to align with the West. He thought, if Russia integrates with institutions like NATO, things will stabilize, they'll prosper.
Makes sense on the surface.
Right. But it didn't really work out the way he planned.
It seems like maybe that strategy backfired a bit. So is that where Primakov steps onto the scene?
Yeah. So Primakov comes in, Yevgeny Primakov.
Yeah.
He was this really seasoned diplomat. He eventually becomes prime minister. And he had a very different vision for Russia's role in the world.
Okay. I'm intrigued.
He saw the U.S. as, dominating the world stage. This unipolar system, kind of like, imagine like a high school where you've got like one single all-powerful student body president making every single decision.
Okay, got it. I see where you're going with this. So Primakov's not really into the whole one kid rules the school situation?
Yeah. Not at all. He was really pushing for what he called a multipolar system.
Okay.
Think more like a school with multiple powerful student groups,
yeah.
right? Each with their own influence, their own alliances. He thought this would lead to a more, balanced, peaceful kind of world order.
I like that analogy. That's helpful. So how did he actually try to, put this vision into practice? Like, what did it look like in action?
Well, there's one event that really kind of shows Primakov's approach. It was 1999. He's flying to Washington as prime minister, and he gets news that NATO is bombing Serbia. Now, Serbia was a traditional Russian ally. So to Primakov, this felt like the West completely disregarding Russia's interests.
Yeah, I can see how that would rub them the wrong way. So, wait, did he just, shrug it off? What did he do?
So Primakov does something that makes news all over the world. He turns his plane around mid-flight over the Atlantic, cancels his visit to Washington in protest.
Wow, that's a bold move. All right, so that's a pretty clear message. So the turn over the Atlantic, as it's called, it seems like that really put the Primakov Doctrine on the map.
Yeah, it really did. It was a turning point for Russia's foreign policy. They were done seeking approval from the West and ready to, assert themselves on the world stage. And that's really where you start to see the three core pillars of the Primakov Doctrine take shape.
Okay, pillars, let's break those down.
Yeah.
What's the first one about?
So the first pillar, like we talked about, is rejecting that unipolar world dominated by the U.S.
Right.
Primakov thought that having all that power concentrated in one place, it's just not stable. And frankly, it's not fair. He wanted a multipolar world with, multiple centers of power. And he thought this would lead to a more balanced and peaceful global order.
Right. So less of a dictatorship, more of like a student council type of thing.
Exactly. And there's even some, academic theory to back this up. Some international relations experts think that these multipolar systems can actually be more stable because it stops any one power from getting, way too dominant.
Huh. Interesting. So there's more to this whole multipolarity thing than meets the eye. Okay. But let's talk about the other two pillars. How did Primakov think Russia should, act in this multipolar world he was envisioning?
All right, so that brings us to the second pillar, strategic partnerships. Primakov knew that Russia couldn't do it alone.
Right.
He had to find allies. He wanted to build relationships with other rising powers, especially China and India.
Okay, so strength in numbers, like forming a new student group to challenge the existing one?
Exactly. And this idea is a big part of why groups like BRICS were formed.
BRICS?
Yeah. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It's kind of like a counter to the G7, which is, dominated by Western countries.
Yeah.
And this whole focus on strategic partnerships with China especially has become even more important in recent years.
Yeah, it definitely seems like something we need to dig into a little more. But first, what about that third pillar? We know Russia's had some issues with NATO. How does that fit in?
Okay, so the third pillar, it's all about opposing NATO expansion. From Russia's point of view, NATO moving east felt like a direct threat to their security.
Right.
Almost like a broken promise from the end of the Cold War. Like imagine a bunch of your old classmates suddenly joining a rival group that keeps getting closer and closer to your turf.
Yeah.
You'd get a little nervous.
Yeah, I get it. Makes sense that they'd be concerned.
Okay.
So we've got these 3 pillars, right? Rejecting U.S. dominance, forming strategic partnerships, and opposing NATO expansion. But how did this actually play out in the real world? Like, what did the Primakov Doctrine look like in practice?
Well, that's where things get really interesting because the Primakov Doctrine, it's not just some, abstract idea. It's a framework that has guided and still guides many of Russia's actions on the world stage.
Okay, I'm ready to see how this all plays out. Let's connect the dots to what's happening today.
Let's do it.
Okay, so we've talked about, the history and like the main ideas behind the Primakov Doctrine. But how is it actually shaping Russia's actions today, like in the real world?
It really is fascinating how this doctrine, from decades ago can still be so relevant.
Right, it's like Primakov had a time machine or something. But so is the doctrine like a set of rules they have to follow? Or has it like changed over time?
It's definitely not like set in stone. It's more of a framework that adapts to new situations.
Yeah.
And it's not just about being against the West. It's really about Russia, pursuing its own interests, making sure it has a place in the world and, a world that they want to be more, equitable, where power is distributed more evenly.
So less about anti-West and more about pro-Russia and, promoting their vision of a multipolar world. I mean, is that even realistic? Is the world really becoming multipolar?
That's a big question, right? But in a way it is. I mean, look at the rise of China. India, other economies are growing and it's shifting the balance of power. We're seeing new alliances and partnerships that challenge the old, Western-led order.
So Primakov's vision might actually be happening. That's kind of wild. But I mean, is it all smooth sailing toward this multipolar world?
Well, not exactly.
Yeah.
While the world is becoming more multipolar, it's definitely a messy process.
Yeah.
There are going to be, challenges and obstacles. For example, think about the Russia-China partnership.
Okay.
They're getting closer, but they still have different interests and priorities.
Right. Even the best of friends disagree sometimes. Like any relationship, there's always that potential for conflict.
Exactly. And it raises another question.
Huh?
Will this multipolar world that Primakov, imagined, will it actually be more stable and peaceful?
Mm-hmm.
Or will it just lead to more, friction and conflict between these new centers of power?
So it's not all sunshine and roses in this multipolar world. There are downsides too.
Right. There could be more uncertainty, and it might be harder to, deal with global problems that need everyone to work together, like climate change. Think about it like trying to get a whole classroom of students to agree on a class project when everyone has their own agenda. It's not easy.
That's a good point. So more balanced maybe, but also more complex and, potentially for more conflict.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so important to really understand these complexities and, think critically about them. There are no easy answers when it comes to, international relations.
Well said. Okay, but speaking of complex situations, we can't really ignore what's happening in Ukraine. I mean, it seems like a pretty clear example of this multipolar world playing out and, things getting really messy and uncertain.
You're absolutely right. The war in Ukraine is a tragedy, and there are many factors that led to it. But the Primakov Doctrine can help us understand some of Russia's motivations.
Yeah.
Like their desire to stop NATO from expanding was a big reason why they decided to invade.
Right. That was that third pillar we talked about. So they basically saw Ukraine joining NATO as like a line they would not cross a threat. They were willing to use force to prevent.
Yeah, and it really shows that these geopolitical doctrines aren't just, ideas.
Mm-hmm.
They can have serious consequences in the real world.
Yeah, definitely a reminder that understanding these doctrines is more important now than ever.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but let's shift gears for a second and talk about another part of the Primakov Doctrine in action, the growing partnership between Russia and China.
Right.
We touched on this earlier. But, how has this partnership evolved in recent years? And what does it mean for, the global order?
So we've seen Russia and China getting a lot closer, especially because of the tension with the West. This partnership has really big implications for both economics and strategy.
Okay, hold on. I'm curious about something. If the doctrine is all about strategic partnerships, isn't there a risk that China, with all its power, could kind of overshadow Russia in this alliance?
That's a really good point. And it's definitely something to think about. Even though the partnership benefits both countries, there's always a chance that one side could become too dominant. But right now, it seems like both Russia and China see the relationship as, mutually beneficial.
So it's a balancing act, cooperation, but also competition. It seems like this partnership is like a key piece of the puzzle when it comes to this multipolar world. But how does it actually, challenge the existing world order?
So it challenges the existing order in a few ways.
Mm-hmm.
Economically, it creates alternative systems for trade and finance that don't depend on the U.S. dollar. Strategically, it creates a united front against what both Russia and China see as, Western interference. And militarily, their joint exercises and, sharing technology, it all increases their combined power.
So they're working on multiple fronts to build this, alternative multipolar world that Primakov envisioned.
Exactly. And it's not just limited to Russia and China. Russia's also been active in other organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO, and the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the CSTO.
So building a network, finding new student groups to join and, exert their influence in this new world order.
Exactly. It's about creating different platforms for cooperation and security, outside of the systems that are dominated by the West.
Okay, so the Primakov Doctrine, it's a powerful way to understand how Russia operates on the world stage. We've covered a lot, from the history to what it means today. But what about the future? Will this doctrine keep shaping Russia's actions in the years to come?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one that deserves its own, in-depth look.
Okay, so we've talked about how the Primakov Doctrine, shapes Russia's actions, its partnerships, its stance on NATO and all that. But, what does it all mean for the future? Is this doctrine something that's here to stay?
Well, the Primakov Doctrine, it's not just about understanding the past. It's about, trying to figure out what might happen next. And while we can't predict the future, for sure the doctrine gives us some hints about what could happen.
So let's pretend we have a crystal ball for a minute.
Right.
What are some possible futures based on what we know about this doctrine?
Okay, so one possibility is that what we're seeing now just continues. The world keeps becoming more multipolar, driven by the rise of, powers like China.
Yeah.
This could mean that the U.S., becomes less dominant, and we end up with a more fragmented global order with multiple power centers kind of competing for influence. Imagine a world where decisions aren't just made in Washington, but also in Beijing, Moscow, Delhi. It's a big shift from how things have been for the last few decades.
Yeah, that's a huge change. But would this multipolar world automatically be a good thing? What about the risk of, conflict?
That's a really important point. A more multipolar world could mean more uncertainty, more volatility as, these different powers try to figure out their place. Think back to that classroom analogy we talked about before. More groups fighting for power could lead to more disagreements, even clashes. And then there's the question of, global challenges like climate change. How would those be addressed in a world that's more fragmented?
It seems like a multipolar world, while it could be more balanced, it also comes with, its own set of risks and challenges. So besides this, shift in power, are there other possibilities?
Yeah, definitely. Another possibility is that this whole move towards, multipolarity, it stalls or even reverses. The U.S. could decide to, try even harder to maintain its global dominance. And that could lead to, renewed competition between the superpowers.
So basically two very different paths. A more balanced world that could be unstable, or a return to, tension and a standoff between superpowers.
Yeah.
Both with, big consequences.
Exactly. And those are just two possibilities. There are many others. The future is shaped by so many things, economic trends, technology stuff we can't even predict. But the Primakov Doctrine gives us a framework to, understand the forces at play.
So even though we can't know the future for sure, the Primakov Doctrine helps us, analyze things and think about what might happen, which is pretty powerful in itself.
I agree. And it shows how important it is to stay informed, to think critically, and to consider different points of view. The world's getting more complex, and we need all the help we can get to, navigate it all.
Well said. You've given us a lot to think about. Before we go, I have one last question for our listeners, something to really ponder. If the Primakov Doctrine is all about Russia shaping the world to fit its interests, what does that mean for everyone else? Is it a zero-sum game where one country wins and another one loses? Or is there a way for everyone to cooperate and benefit in this multipolar world? Those are the questions we need to be asking ourselves as we move forward.
Those are the big questions, the ones that will really shape the world we live in.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the Primakov Doctrine. We hope you've learned something new and have a new way of looking at Russia's place in the world. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.